The morning sky shimmered like polished steel as Lucas Mason taxied his plane along the narrow strip that cut through his property, a private runway bordered by wild grass and the ghosts of his own past. The wind slid over the wings with a low hum, a familiar voice that spoke of freedom, precision, and escape. Flying was the only time Lucas felt balanced, the only moment when his body, mind, and the world beneath him existed in the same rhythm. On the ground, life demanded compromise, paperwork, and explanations. But in the air, there was only truth. His hangar stood at the far edge of the field, a wide steel structure that gleamed under the morning light. He had built it by hand over 5 long years, pouring into it everything he had saved since leaving the Air Force. Inside, the scent of oil and metal blended with that faint sweetness of old paint and worn leather. His vintage warbird, a relic from World War II, rested there like a sleeping animal, its silver body reflecting fragments of the sky. Every bolt, every panel, every scar on the fuselage carried a story, and Lucas treated the machine not as an object but as a memory made solid. He had lived alone since his discharge, keeping mostly to himself on his land that bordered the edge of the Willow Creek estates. The Homeowners Association never liked him much. They said his hangar was an eyesore, that the noise of his engines disturbed the suburban peace they all prized so dearly. But Lucas paid his taxes, maintained his property, and kept to his side of the fence. He had all the required permits, federal, county, zoning, all signed, all paid for. Yet each year a new notice appeared in his mailbox. Noise complaint. Unauthorized structure. Community nuisance. He stopped responding. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't argue with people who built their identities on rules. They didn't care about fairness, only control. That morning he had taken off early. The wind calm and visibility perfect. The horizon stretched endless and blue, and for a brief hour the rest of the world disappeared. He imagined his old squadron flying beside him, imagined his commanding officer's voice calling through the radio. For a few minutes he wasn't a middle-aged man living alone among people who wanted him gone. He was a pilot again, weightless and alive. When the message came through his headset, he thought it was static at first. Then came the words, broken by interference but unmistakable. "Lucas, you better get back. They're tearing it down." The voice belonged to his neighbor, Sam, an old mechanic who helped him with the plane on weekends. Lucas's pulse froze. "Say again," he barked into the mic. "The hangar," Sam shouted over the line. "They brought in heavy equipment, HOA trucks. You need to get back now." Lucas banked hard, the horizon tilting sharply as the airframe shuddered under the strain. The return flight took only 20 minutes, but each one felt like a lifetime. From above, he saw the dust first. Thick, rising clouds that drifted across his property like smoke. Then he saw the machines. 3 yellow bulldozers and a pickup marked with the HOA logo parked near the gate. His hangar, his heart, his years of work, was collapsing in on itself, the roof folding like paper under the weight of the machines. He circled once, disbelieving, his stomach twisting. There was no warning, no notice of violation nailed to his fence, no court order, just destruction. He radioed the tower at the nearby airfield, voice tight with anger, and requested permission to land. The controller hesitated when Lucas gave his coordinates. Even she must have heard the roar of the engines and the tearing of metal through her headset. When Lucas finally touched down on the neighbor's strip and sprinted toward his land, the ground still trembled from the heavy machinery. The hangar was gone, just a mangled skeleton of steel and smoke. His vintage plane, the one he had spent a decade restoring, sat helpless in the open air, its tail section crushed under twisted beams. The men operating the bulldozers didn't even look at him. They climbed into a white truck as if leaving an ordinary work site. He shouted, demanded to know who authorized the demolition. The driver simply handed him an envelope with the HOA seal and said, "Talk to the board, sir. We're just following orders." Then they drove away, leaving him in the dust and the ringing silence that follows catastrophe. Lucas stood in the wreckage, his boots sinking into the broken gravel, the metallic taste of disbelief coating his tongue. A half-burned sign leaned against the debris, the letters still visible. Community Safety Enforcement, Willow Creek, HOA. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. Safety. They'd called it safety while they destroyed everything that kept him sane. In the wind, pieces of corrugated metal scraped against the ground, each sound cutting like a blade. For a long moment, he couldn't move. His hands trembled, his throat constricted, and somewhere deep in his chest the fury began to rise. Not the kind that burned out quickly, but the cold kind that waited, patient and deliberate, like a storm on the horizon. When Lucas finally gathered himself enough to step closer to the ruins, the air was still thick with dust and the sour smell of burnt wiring. The wind scraped through the exposed frame, making it groan like something alive and suffering. His boots crunched over shattered glass and twisted bolts as he reached the mangled body of his aircraft, the once proud machine that had been the heart of his world. The left wing was torn away, the propeller bent like a ribbon, the cockpit canopy split and dangling from a twisted hinge. He ran his hand over the fuselage, the metal still warm from friction and sunlight, and for the first time in years he felt a helplessness that reminded him too much of the battlefield. The calm discipline of a man who had flown into war could not steady him against this kind of destruction, the kind that came in daylight, under the banner of neighborhood regulations and printed letters with smiling logos. A pickup truck pulled up behind him, its tires rolling slowly over the gravel. A woman stepped out, polished, smiling, her clipboard held like a weapon. She was in her 50s, with a perfectly ironed blouse and sunglasses that hid her eyes. "Mr. Mason," she began, her tone syrupy with official civility. "I'm Beverly Hart, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I understand this must be difficult, but we had no choice." Her words hit him like shrapnel. He turned, staring at her in disbelief. "No choice," he repeated, his voice low and edged. "You destroyed federal property. You demolished my hangar, on my land, without a warrant." She tilted her head with a faint, dismissive smile as though speaking to a child. "Your structure was classified as an unauthorized, non-conforming facility. The board voted unanimously to remove it after multiple safety complaints. You were sent notices, Mr. Mason. Several, in fact." Lucas stepped closer until his reflection glinted off her sunglasses. "There were no notices," he said, voice steady now like he was back in the cockpit. "You forged something, or you buried it. Either way, what you did here is illegal." Beverly sighed, the sound dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "I'm afraid that's for our legal department to determine. I'm sure this is an emotional moment for you, but I advise against escalating the situation further. Any aggressive behavior will be documented." She pointed toward a man standing by the truck with a phone, recording. "We're ensuring transparency." For a moment, Lucas thought about what it would feel like to rip that phone out of the man's hand, to make them understand what they had done, but he swallowed the impulse. He had seen how rage could be used against a man, how a single outburst could erase the truth. Instead, he said quietly, "You people just made the worst mistake of your lives." Beverly's smile didn't falter, but he saw the flicker of unease behind it. She gave a curt nod to her assistant and climbed back into the truck. The vehicle reversed, kicking up a cloud of dust that blurred everything in sight. When it cleared, Lucas stood alone again, surrounded by the corpse of what had been his home. He spent the rest of the day sifting through the wreckage, salvaging what little he could, pieces of aluminum, scorched flight manuals, a photograph of his squadron half buried under debris. By evening, exhaustion settled over him like a weight, but sleep refused to come. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. When night fell, he sat on the back of his pickup with a flashlight, reading the letter Beverly had handed him. The words were wrapped in legal jargon that twisted guilt into procedure. Following repeated code violations and safety concerns, the Willow Creek HOA Board has exercised its authority under Article 14, Section C of the Community Preservation Act to remove the unapproved structure located at 782 County Line Road. Below that, a stamped signature in the line, executed with municipal oversight. Lucas knew what that meant. They had someone at the county office, a clerk or inspector, who had helped rubber stamp the paperwork. He scanned the letter again and noticed the date. The permit for demolition had been approved the same morning he took off. Someone had waited for him to leave before giving the order. He grabbed his phone and called the number listed on the document for Community Affairs Liaison. The line rang until a polite recorded voice answered, thanking him for his cooperation and inviting him to submit further inquiries in writing. He hung up, his pulse hammering, and dialed the county zoning department instead. After several transfers, a tired-sounding man finally answered. Lucas explained what had happened, his voice clipped but controlled. The man listened, then hesitated. "Mr. Mason," he said finally, "according to our records, your hangar was reclassified as a temporary storage structure 3 weeks ago. You signed the form yourself." "I what?" Lucas snapped. "That's impossible." The clerk's tone softened as if he already knew something was wrong but didn't want to say it. "Look, sir, the form's in our database. It has your signature. Maybe check with your homeowners association before you file a complaint. If it's an internal zoning issue, there's not much we can do." The line went dead. Lucas stared at the dark screen, his reflection faint in the glass. His signature. They had forged it. They had gone into county records and changed the classification to clear the way for demolition. It wasn't just vindictive. It was coordinated. He returned to the site before dawn, the air cold and heavy with dew. The machines were gone, but the damage was everywhere. The hangar's foundation was cracked, the soil torn and uneven, littered with metal scraps and fragments of concrete. He walked slowly across the property, noticing fresh tire tracks that cut deep into the mud and footprints leading toward the access road. Whoever had done this hadn't even tried to hide their trail. Near the edge of the property, he found a wooden stake driven into the ground with a small red flag fluttering from it. The flag bore the mark of a development company he recognized. Goldstone Engineering, a firm that had been circling this area for years, trying to buy up land for a planned luxury complex. They had offered to buy his property once, and he'd refused. Now, it made sense. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were clearing the path for investors. When the sun rose, Lucas went to the police station, still carrying the letter and a handful of photographs he had taken of the destruction. The officer at the front desk listened, expression blank. "That sounds like a civil matter, sir," he said after glancing at the letter. "If they had municipal authorization, we can't intervene." "Municipal authorization based on forged documents," Lucas shot back. "That's criminal." The officer's expression didn't change. "You'll need to take that up with your lawyer." He handed the papers back like they were meaningless scraps of paper. "I'll make a note of your statement." When Lucas pressed further, the officer lowered his voice and said quietly, "Between you and me, sir, the HOA here's got ties with the council. You won't get far unless you've got money or someone on the inside." The words carried the weight of resignation, not conspiracy, just the weary acceptance of a man who'd seen this before. By the time Lucas left the station, the sun was high and the heat shimmered over the asphalt. His mind was racing, each thought colliding with the next, forming a single, burning clarity. They wanted him gone. The noise complaints, the zoning disputes, the letters, they had all been steps leading to this moment. They had waited for him to leave the ground so they could strike, ensuring there'd be no confrontation, no witnesses. As he drove back home, he imagined the faces of the men who had stood there, laughing, while his hangar fell apart. He imagined Beverly's smile as she signed the papers. He imagined the investors shaking hands behind closed doors, congratulating each other for another redevelopment victory. The anger returned, colder now, sharper. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't even clench his fists. He simply whispered to himself, "They think they've won." The words hung in the cab like a vow. When he reached his property again, the late afternoon light was fading, painting everything in rust and gold. The wreckage glowed faintly in the dying sun, like the bones of a fallen creature. He stood there until darkness swallowed the field, until the chill set into his bones. The plane was beyond repair, but the fight wasn't. He took a deep breath and looked at the empty space where the hangar once stood, and in that hollow he felt something solid form. Not grief, not despair, but resolve. The sky that had always given him freedom now looked like an ally waiting above, silent and endless. He turned toward the house, the letter still crumpled in his hand, and whispered, almost to himself, "You wanted a war, Beverly. You've got one." The next morning, the air over Willow Creek hung heavy with humidity and the metallic scent of rain that had not yet fallen. Lucas hadn't slept. His mind replayed every image of the destruction until dawn. The coffee on the counter had gone cold, untouched, and the letter from the HOA lay crumpled beneath his palm like a wound that refused to close. He needed answers, real ones, not the rehearsed lines of HOA representatives or polite indifference of county clerks. By 7, he was already on the road, heading toward the municipal zoning office with a folder full of photographs, receipts, and permits. The receptionist, a young man with earbuds half hidden beneath his hair, looked up only long enough to tell him to take a seat. When Lucas's turn finally came, the clerk behind the glass barely glanced at the papers he slid across the counter. Her badge read, E. Daniels, Zoning Compliance. She tapped her keyboard a few times, frowned, and said, "According to our records, that structure didn't exist." The words landed like a slap. Lucas leaned forward, forcing his tone to remain calm. "Didn't exist? I have permits from 3 years ago, signed, sealed, approved by this very office." She kept typing. "Not anymore. It was deregistered as a permanent structure and reclassified under temporary storage before removal." "You'd have received notice." "I didn't," he said sharply. "Someone forged my signature." Daniels met his eyes then, the first sign of discomfort on her otherwise neutral face. "If you believe there was a forgery, you can file a civil complaint. But as of now, the record shows everything was done according to process." Lucas saw something flicker in her gaze. Fear, maybe, or resignation. He wanted to push, but he recognized that look. It was the look of someone who'd already been warned to stay quiet. He gathered his papers, thanked her through clenched teeth, and walked out into the sweltering morning light. Outside, the parking lot shimmered with heat. He sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the stack of papers in his lap. The system was airtight. Every route he took looped back to the same wall of bureaucracy, each form stamped with the false comfort of official approval. It was a structure built to grind down anyone who dared to fight. He started the engine, the hum of the motor echoing in his chest, and decided to go straight to the HOA office. If Beverly wanted to play official, then he would confront her on her own ground. The HOA headquarters was a converted ranch house at the center of the subdivision, painted in the same soulless beige as every other home. The parking lot was empty except for a single black SUV parked under the oak trees. Lucas recognized it, the same one from the day of the demolition. He parked beside it and stepped out, every movement deliberate, controlled. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly, masking the faint sound of typing from down the hall. A receptionist looked up, startled as he entered. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice too calm, too rehearsed. "I'm here to see Beverly Hart." "Do you have an appointment?" No, but you'll want to tell her it's about the hangar she destroyed. The woman's fingers froze above her keyboard. For a moment, Lucas thought she would refuse, but then she picked up the phone and murmured something into it. A minute later, Beverly appeared in the doorway, immaculate as ever, her expression a mask of composed irritation. "Mr. Mason," she said, her tone clipped. "I thought we discussed this." "We didn't discuss anything," Lucas said evenly. "You trespassed, you forged documents, and you destroyed private property. We're going to discuss that now." Beverly smiled thinly and gestured toward a small conference room. "Let's not disturb the staff." The room was sterile. Laminated table, white walls, framed photographs of manicured lawns and smiling families. Beverly closed the door and sat opposite him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "You seem upset," she began. "Understandably, but I assure you, everything was done within the scope of our authority." Lucas placed the folder on the table and pushed it toward her. "You'll see the original permits right there, stamped by the county. You'll also notice the dates. Your reclassification happened 2 years later, after the structure was built, after approval. You had no jurisdiction." She flipped through the documents with a bored expression, though her fingers trembled slightly. "Mr. Mason, our community regulations clearly state that any structure deemed non-compliant can be removed if it poses a safety risk." "Safety risk to who?" he demanded. "To your property values? You bulldozed a federally registered aircraft restoration site." Her eyes narrowed. "Let's not be dramatic. You were running a private airstrip in a residential zone. That violates multiple ordinances." "That airstrip predates your HOA," Lucas said. "I bought this land before Willow Creek even existed." She leaned back, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Times change, Mr. Mason. Communities evolve. Perhaps it's time you consider doing the same." The words were practiced, almost gleeful in their cruelty. He realized then that she wasn't defending a mistake. She was protecting a strategy. There was money behind this. Pressure from the development company he'd seen on the flag. She was just one cog in a larger machine. Lucas rose from his chair, gathering his papers. "I'll be filing charges," he said quietly. "Forgery, fraud, property destruction. You and everyone who signed those documents will answer for this." Beverly's smile returned, smaller now but colder. "You're free to try, but I'd advise caution. Making false allegations against an HOA can carry serious consequences." The threat hung in the air like smoke. He turned without another word and left. As he stepped into the sunlight, the black SUV caught his eye again. A man sat inside, engine idling, sunglasses glinting. Lucas met his gaze for a moment, and the man looked away, pretending to check his phone. It was intimidation, plain and simple. He climbed into his truck and drove home, every nerve tight as wire. By the time he reached his property, a fresh notice was taped to his gate, a bright yellow sheet declaring fines for unauthorized debris storage and failure to maintain community aesthetics. He tore it down and crumpled it in his fist. The ashes of his hangar lay scattered behind him, the twisted skeleton of metal catching the late afternoon light. He set up a camera on a tripod at the edge of the property, angled toward the road, and installed a second one facing the field. If they wanted to watch him, he'd watch them back. The following days passed in uneasy quiet, the kind that hums with tension just before a storm. Trucks drove by slowly, neighbors whispered behind curtains, and each night he saw the same black SUV parked a little further down the road. Once, at midnight, he stepped outside and found his mailbox open, the flag bent backward as if by a deliberate hand. He said nothing to the police. He knew they'd do nothing. He started keeping his service pistol close again, cleaning it every night with the same care he once gave to his aircraft. On the third morning, he found tire tracks leading up to the remains of the hangar. Fresh ones. Someone had come onto his property in the night. He followed the marks until they disappeared near the trees, where he discovered a small drone tangled in the weeds. It still blinked with a dying red light. He picked it up, turned it over, and saw the HOA logo printed neatly on the side. He laughed, a low, disbelieving sound. They were surveilling him now, trying to provoke him into a mistake. He placed the drone on the hood of his truck and crushed it beneath his boot until the plastic cracked and the blinking stopped. The sound was satisfying in a grim way. But as he looked up at the empty sky, the laughter faded. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a campaign, slow, methodical, designed to erase him piece by piece until he either surrendered or disappeared from their neatly trimmed world. He stood there in the silence of his ruined land, the broken machine at his feet, and whispered to the wind, "You think I'll break." His voice was calm, almost tender. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The storm he'd been holding inside finally began to take shape, not loud or reckless, but steady, inevitable and ready to strike. Rain began before dawn, a slow, relentless drizzle that soaked through the cracked earth and turned the wreckage of Lucas's hangar into a landscape of rust and reflection. The water collected in shallow pools on the twisted metal beams, distorting his reflection every time he walked past. It had been 2 weeks since the demolition, and though the noise of bulldozers had faded, the silence that followed was worse. His days blurred into one another, calls to lawyers who refused to take the case without a massive retainer, messages left with the county inspector that were never returned, and long nights sitting on his porch staring at the empty field where his life's work had stood. The black SUV had stopped parking by the road, but that only made him more uneasy. He'd learned during the war that when your enemy goes quiet, it isn't mercy, it's strategy. On the 3rd morning of rain, he received an unexpected visitor. A silver sedan pulled up to his gate, and a woman stepped out, holding a notebook and a press badge. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, maybe early 30s, with rain darkening her jacket and strands of hair sticking to her face. "Mr. Mason," she called. Her voice was clear and confident, cutting through the hiss of rain. Amanda rose. "I'm with the Willow Creek Tribune. I was told you might be willing to talk about what happened here." Lucas studied her through the gate for a long moment. Reporters had come before, hungry for controversy, gone the next day when a juicier scandal appeared. "What exactly do you want?" he asked finally. She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained sharp. "The truth. The official story doesn't make sense. The HOA claims your hangar was condemned due to safety concerns, but the demolition permit was processed in record time, 15 minutes. That doesn't happen without pressure." He felt the familiar surge of anger stir in his chest, but kept his tone even. "Pressure from who?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," she said, glancing past him toward the wreckage. "May I?" He hesitated, then opened the gate. She stepped inside, walking slowly, her shoes sinking into the wet ground. Her gaze moved over the debris with a mix of curiosity and unease. "It looks like a bomb went off." "Feels that way," he replied. Except the bomb had a logo and a meeting agenda. She gave a small surprised laugh, then knelt to take a photo. "I looked into the company listed on the demolition order," she said, her voice quieter now. "Goldstone Engineering. They've been buying up parcels all over this area under shell subsidiaries. And guess who signed the last approval?" Lucas didn't need to guess. "Beverly Hart," he said, and Amanda nodded. "She's on the HOA board and has personal investments in Goldstone's parent company. It's not just about your hangar, Mr. Mason. They're clearing land for a new development, an eco-friendly residential extension. That hangar was in their way." The words didn't surprise him, but hearing them aloud made something inside him lock into place. "So they falsified documents to make it happen." "Almost certainly," Amanda said. but I need proof that will hold up. I can write a story, but if we're going to stop them, it has to be bigger than a headline." He looked at her closely. She didn't have the bored detachment of most reporters. There was something personal behind her determination, something that made her push forward despite the danger. "Why do you care?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Because my father lost his house the same way. HOA foreclosure over unpaid dues that didn't exist. I know how this works, and I know what it does to people." For the first time in weeks, Lucas felt something other than anger, something like recognition. "Then we do it together," he said. They spent the next several days gathering evidence. Amanda had a network of sources inside the county offices, clerks who owed her favors or simply wanted to see justice done. Through them, she obtained copies of the internal emails between the HOA and the zoning department. Lucas sat beside her as she scrolled through the correspondence, his jaw tightening with each message. The language was bureaucratic, detached, but the intent was unmistakable: to reclassify his property, erase its prior zoning designation, and clear it for redevelopment. One email from Beverly herself read, "Ensure that 782 County Line is processed under Section 12A before Monday. The owner is uncooperative. Expedite the order." Another, from a county official, replied, "Consider it handled. Will require your signature to finalize documentation." The timestamp was the morning his hangar came down. Lucas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "They didn't even bother to hide it," he said. Amanda's expression was grim. "People like that don't need to hide. They assume no one will fight back." Later that evening, they drove to the county records office to verify the signature on the reclassification form. The clerk on duty, a man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on his nose, compared the scanned document to Lucas's driver's license. After a long silence, he looked up and said quietly, "That's not your signature." He printed the comparison and slid it across the counter. "I'll deny saying this if anyone asks, but what they did is felony forgery. Problem is, getting anyone to act on it will be another matter." Lucas felt the quiet burn of vindication mixed with fury. They finally had proof, but proof meant nothing without power. On the way back, Amanda said, "We can take this to the state attorney's office. If the county's compromised, we go higher." "They'll bury it," he said. "They always do." "Then we don't give them the chance. We go public." Her voice carried a confidence he didn't yet share, but he wanted to. That night, Lucas sat at his kitchen table while rain hammered against the windows. The house felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in with the weight of everything he'd lost. Across from him, Amanda was reviewing files, her laptop screen casting a cold blue glow. "If we publish this," he said slowly, "they'll come after you." She didn't look up. "They already have. 2 anonymous calls, 1 thread about my press credentials. Doesn't matter." He admired her steadiness. It reminded him of the pilots he used to fly with, those who could face chaos with a clear mind. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields, and in that sound he heard something like permission. "Then we move forward," he said. "No more waiting." She smiled faintly. "Good, because I think I just found our smoking gun." She turned the screen toward him. It was a scanned contract between the HOA and Goldstone, labeled Community Improvement Initiative. Buried in the fine print was a clause granting the developer exclusive rights to redevelopment on any properties deemed non-compliant. The HE document had been signed 6 months before his hangar was demolished. Lucas read it twice before speaking. They were planning this from the start. They needed one example, Amanda said, one owner to make the rest comply. You were it. He nodded slowly, absorbing the enormity of it. The hangar hadn't been collateral damage. It had been a demonstration, a message to every other homeowner who might resist. For the first time since the demolition, he felt something shift inside him, a spark that cut through the fog of helplessness. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" Amanda asked. "To thank Beverly for her transparency," he said, his tone flat. He arrived at the HOA office just before closing. The receptionist looked startled to see him but didn't stop him when he pushed past her desk. Beverly was in her office, standing by the window with a glass of white wine, speaking on her phone. When she saw him, her expression froze. "I'll call you back," she said into the receiver, then turned to face him. "Mr. Mason, this is highly inappropriate." "You forged my signature," he said quietly. "You lied to the county, and I have proof. Emails, contracts, everything." Her face tightened, though her voice remained smooth. "Those are serious accusations. I hope you understand the gravity of making them." "I understand it better than you think," he replied. "You thought you could scare me, drive me off my land, but you underestimated how far I'm willing to go." She crossed her arms, her nails tapping softly against her sleeve. "And what exactly do you think you can do, Mr. Mason?" "You're one man against a board, a company, and a system designed to protect both." He smiled, not a pleasant smile, but the kind that carried a promise. "You're right, one man can't fight that. But a man with proof and a reporter who doesn't scare easy? That's different." For the first time, Beverly's confidence cracked. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You'll ruin yourself." "You already did that for me," he answered. He turned and left before she could reply. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy, bruised with the color of stormlight. He drove home with the windows down, the smell of wet earth filling the cab. When he reached his gate, he saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Amanda's car pulled up beside him. "You okay?" she asked. "Better than I've been in weeks," he said. "We've got what we need." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Then let's make sure everyone else sees it too." The storm above them finally broke, a roll of thunder echoing through the hills, but this time, the sound didn't feel like warning. It felt like justice gathering strength. The story broke 3 days later, and by noon, the whole town was talking about it. Amanda's article appeared on the front page of the Willow Creek Tribune under the headline, "Veterans' Property Demolished in HOA Scheme, Linked to Real Estate Developers." The piece detailed everything: the forged signature, the internal emails, the conflict of interest between Beverly Hart and Goldstone Engineering. Lucas had expected outrage, maybe sympathy, but what came instead was silence from the authorities and a carefully worded statement from the HOA claiming that the article contained inaccuracies and unverified allegations. Beverly called it defamation against a respected community institution. The next day, Lucas's mailbox was stuffed with anonymous letters, some of them supportive, most of them venomous. "You're destroying property values. You should be ashamed of yourself. Why don't you just sell and leave?" Others were worse, crude threats written in block letters, no return address. He burned them in a metal barrel behind his house and watched the paper curl and vanish into ash. The smoke rose into the overcast sky like a warning that no one would see. By the end of the week, the pressure had escalated. Someone filed multiple complaints against him: noise violations, improper waste disposal, unsafe property conditions. County inspectors arrived without warning, taking photographs of his yard, his broken hangar, even the shed where he kept tools. When Lucas confronted them, they avoided his eyes. "We're just following procedure, sir." The phrase had become a curse, the universal excuse for cowardice. That evening, Amanda arrived visibly shaken. "They pulled my article from the online archive," she said. "The publisher received a cease and desist order from the HOA's attorneys claiming I fabricated sources. They're threatening to sue the paper. Lucas felt the anger rise in him like a tide. So that's how they fight. Erase the evidence. Amanda nodded, rubbing her temples. Not just that. I think they've started watching me, too. There's a car parked across from my apartment every night. Same one. No plates. Lucas's voice softened. You can step back from this. You've done enough. No, she said quickly. This isn't just your fight anymore. They've been inside it, a note scrawled in red marker. Drop it, flyboy. He walked outside into the early light, scanning the empty road. No one was there, but the message was clear. He called the sheriff's department, filed a report, and knew as soon as the deputy's bored voice hit his ear that nothing would come of it. Probably just some kids, the man said. We'll make a note of it. Lucas hung up mid-sentence. That night he sat on the porch with his pistol beside him, the air still and heavy. Every rustle in the field made his muscles tighten. He didn't expect them to attack directly. People like Beverly didn't get their hands dirty, but he knew they'd keep pushing until he broke. 2 days later, the retaliation turned official. A certified letter arrived, stamped with county insignia. Notice of pending code enforcement action for illegal hazardous materials storage. It accused him of keeping flammable substances on site and demanded he clear the property or face fines exceeding $25,000. The accusation was absurd. The only thing flammable he owned was aviation fuel, stored legally under permit. It didn't matter. The goal wasn't law, it was exhaustion. He took the letter straight to Amanda, who was already meeting with her editor in a dim coffee shop downtown. They're trying to bury you in paperwork, the editor said after reading the notice. It's a tactic. Bleed you dry with bureaucracy until you can't fight anymore. Lucas folded the paper neatly and said, Then we change the game. Amanda looked up from her laptop. What do you mean? They're counting on me to react defensively. To play by their rules. But rules are only binding when both sides agree to them. That night, Lucas started digging deeper. Using the documents Amanda had gathered, he traced the financial connections between the HOA board members and Goldstone. The pattern was clear. Every property that had been condemned in the last 3 years had been sold to a holding company registered under a different name, but controlled by the same developer. He printed everything: bank transfers, signatures, land assessments, and laid it out across his kitchen table like a battle map. The more he read, the clearer it became that his case was just one part of a much larger machine. They were flipping entire neighborhoods, forcing homeowners out under the guise of community development, then selling the land to luxury builders. It was organized theft disguised as civic improvement. As he worked, headlights swept across the wall. He froze, listening. The rumble of an engine idled outside. Slowly, he reached for the pistol on the table and stepped onto the porch. A car was parked at the end of his drive, not the black SUV this time, but a white sedan with tinted windows. The driver's door opened and a man in a raincoat stepped out, holding an envelope. "Mr. Mason," he called, voice calm. "Legal service. Need your signature." Lucas didn't move. "Leave it on the fence." The man hesitated, then set the envelope down and drove off without another word. Lucas waited until the taillights vanished before retrieving it. Inside was a summons. The HOA was suing him for defamation, harassment, and unlawful interference with community operations. The damages sought exceeded $2 million, the same amount his plane had been worth. It was poetic, in a grotesque way. They'd taken his property, and now they wanted his silence. Amanda came by as soon as she heard. "They're weaponizing the courts," she said, her voice low with disbelief. "You could lose everything." "I already did," Lucas said. "All they can take now is time." He looked out at the ruins of his hangar, the jagged skeleton still jutting from the mud like broken ribs. If they want a fight in court, we'll give them one. But not their kind of fight. He began contacting the other residents who had lost property to the HOA. Many refused to talk, terrified of retaliation, but a few agreed to meet. One couple had lost their home after the HOA claimed they violated landscaping rules. Another had their garage demolished for being structurally unsafe. Each story followed the same pattern: intimidation, false notices, sudden reclassification, and forced sale. Amanda documented everything, recording testimonies and collecting documents. Piece by piece, the picture grew larger, darker, undeniable. Within a week, her editor was gone. Officially, he had resigned, but she learned through a colleague that he'd been pressured by the paper's investors, several of whom were tied to Goldstone. The next day, her apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, just papers moved, files left open on her desk. Lucas insisted she stay at his place until things settled. "You'll be safer here," he said. She gave him a weary look. "You're the one they want, not me." "Exactly," he answered. "That means they'll keep their distance." But deep down, he didn't believe it. He could feel the tension closing in around them, invisible and suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. One night, unable to sleep, he walked back to the hangar site. The moonlight fell across the ruins, silver and cold, and for a moment he thought he saw movement among the debris. He crouched and found something new: metal stakes driven into the ground, each marked with the same red flags as before. He pulled one out, the earth clinging to it like flesh. On the flag, written in neat black ink, were the words, "Phase 2, clearance approved." His blood went cold. They were coming again, planning to seize the rest of his land. He looked up at the horizon where the town lights glowed faintly through the mist and whispered, "Not this time." He took the stake, snapped it in half, and let it fall to the mud. The battle was no longer about his hangar. It was about everything beneath it. The right to exist without surrender. And, for the first time since the day of the demolition, he felt no fear, only purpose. The courtroom was colder than Lucas expected, the kind of artificial chill that seeped through skin and bone, flattening emotion into numb endurance. Rows of spectators filled the benches, a mix of curious locals, reporters, and the quiet presence of HOA members in tailored suits who sat together like a wall of civility. At the front, Beverly Hart occupied her seat with an air of regal calm, her pale hair perfectly arranged, her expression one of injured dignity. The flag behind the judge's bench hung motionless in the still air, and for a moment, Lucas thought of the one that used to wave over his hangar, catching the wind above his plane as if saluting every time he took off. Now there was only this: paper, procedure, and the steady tick of the court's clock measuring out the last beats of patience. Amanda sat beside him, her laptop open, eyes alert but tired. Months of pressure had left their mark. Dark circles beneath her eyes, a stiffness in her shoulders, the constant glance over her shoulder as if expecting another shadow to follow her. The HOA's attorney began with confidence, his voice smooth and theatrical, rehearsed for audiences like this. He painted Lucas as a bitter man, obsessed with control, incapable of living within the cooperative spirit of the community. According to him, the demolition of the hangar had been not an act of malice but of necessity, a decision guided by safety and the greater good. He spoke of zoning codes, environmental hazards, and civic duty until the words blurred together, a polished shield of legality. When he finished, Beverly took the stand, her performance flawless. She spoke with measured grief, describing sleepless nights spent worrying about unauthorized aviation activity endangering children, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "We never wanted this conflict," she said sweetly. "We simply followed the law." Her eyes darted toward Lucas then, and he saw it, the faint spark of satisfaction behind her sorrow. It was the look of someone certain that the outcome had already been purchased. When his turn came, Lucas rose slowly. The courtroom seemed to contract around him, the air thick with the tension of expectation. He didn't have a lawyer who specialized in these battles. He couldn't afford one. Instead, he spoke for himself. "I'm not a lawyer," he began, his voice low but steady. "I'm a pilot. I spent my life following rules because I believed they meant something. I believed in the kind of order that keeps people safe, not the kind that hides greed behind bylaws." He laid out the permits, the zoning records, the email chains. Amanda stepped forward to present the evidence they'd gathered, the forged documents, the signatures, the financial transfers linking HOA board members to Goldstone Engineering. Each exhibit hit the courtroom like a series of blows, methodical and irrefutable. The judge leaned forward, his expression tightening as he scanned the papers. The HOA's attorney objected repeatedly, citing irrelevance, misinterpretation, privacy, every possible shield they could raise, but each objection grew weaker. The rhythm of the trial shifted, and for the first time Beverly's composure began to crack. When Amanda played the recording, Beverly's voice caught on a leaked voicemail discussing accelerating demolition before the owner causes trouble. The room went still. The words hung in the air, calm and unmistakable, like the confession of a crime dressed as routine. Beverly froze, her hand tightening on the armrest and the color drained from her face. Lucas didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The sound of her voice was enough. It was proof that the system she worshipped had finally betrayed her. The judge called a recess. His tone clipped, but the momentum was already irreversible. Outside in the corridor, reporters surged forward, microphones flashing. Amanda answered calmly, stating that the evidence spoke for itself and that this was not an isolated case but part of a pattern that demanded federal review. Lucas said nothing. He stood by the window, looking out at the gray sky and the drizzle streaking the glass. The storm that had been gathering inside him for months finally began to clear, leaving behind something quieter. Not peace exactly, but the stillness that follows a battle once it's won. When court resumed, the verdict came swiftly. The judge ruled the demolition unlawful, the reclassification forged, and the HOA guilty of willful misconduct and conspiracy to defraud. Goldstone's contract was declared void, and the case referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation. Beverly Hart sat motionless, her hands folded tightly together, her mask of confidence shattered beyond repair. The judge's voice carried over the silence like the hum of a distant engine. "Restitution in the amount of $2 million to be paid to Mr. Mason, along with full restoration of his property rights." There was no applause, no outburst, only the soft rustle of papers and the whisper of relief moving through the room. Amanda reached out, her hand brushing his arm, a small gesture of triumph that said more than words. He nodded once, his throat too tight to speak. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared to a pale, washed blue. Reporters crowded the steps, their questions sharp and endless, but Lucas ignored them. He stepped past the noise and into the open air, letting the sunlight hit his face. It felt unreal, fragile, as though any moment someone might step forward and revoke it all. But no one did. For the first time in nearly a year, he could breathe without the weight pressing down on him. Behind him, Amanda gave her statement to the press, her voice steady and certain. "This was never about one man," she said. "It was about a system that forgot who it was supposed to serve. Today, that system was reminded." As they walked toward the parking lot, Lucas glanced back at the courthouse doors. Beverly emerged, flanked by lawyers, her expression hollow, her movements mechanical. For a brief instant, their eyes met across the crowd. There was no victory in his gaze, only finality. She looked away first. The moment passed like a gust of wind, and Lucas turned toward the horizon. The sound of distant engines filled the air. a small aircraft rising from the municipal airfield beyond the town. He watched it climb higher, its wings glinting in the sun. For the first time since his hangar fell, the sight didn't hurt. It only reminded him of what could be rebuilt. Justice, he realized, didn't restore what was lost. It simply cleared the sky so that flight was possible again. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself were catching its breath after a storm. The headlines faded, the lawyers dispersed, and the HOA office, once a symbol of untouchable authority, stood shuttered, its blinds drawn and its sign removed from the gate. Beverly Hart resigned before the criminal trial began, vanishing from Willow Creek without a word. Some said she moved to another state, others claimed she was cooperating with investigators. Lucas didn't care to know. The silence she left behind was enough. The county ordered the land cleared of debris, and one afternoon he stood alone on the field as the last of the rubble was hauled away. The ground was scarred but open, raw and ready for something new. The air smelled of wet soil and iron, and for the first time in months he didn't feel the weight of loss pressing against his chest. The Fight. Amanda's article series was nominated for an Investigative Journalism Award, and she insisted on sharing the recognition with him. "You're the reason this story existed," she told him, and he only smiled, saying that all he did was survive it. They stayed in touch, their conversations easier now, no longer bound by the urgency of crisis. The state attorney's office opened a full investigation into Goldstone Engineering and its network of shell companies, uncovering years of illegal acquisitions and bribery schemes. Other homeowners began to speak out, their stories echoing his, and for once the system began to listen. Lucas refused interviews, avoiding the cameras that wanted to turn him into a symbol. He didn't want fame. He wanted peace. He spent his days rebuilding the hangar, not as a workshop, but as a small museum dedicated to aviation and veterans, a place where the past could be remembered without bitterness. The new structure rose slowly, each beam set with deliberate care, and when the roof was finally sealed, he mounted a single plaque above the entrance. "Freedom belongs to those who refuse to surrender it." On the morning the museum opened, the sky was clear, the air cool and bright. A small crowd gathered, neighbors, local pilots, and a few children waving flags. Amanda was there too, notebook in hand but smiling instead of working. As Lucas spoke a few brief words, his voice carried not pride, but calm resolve. "This isn't about what they took," he said. "It's about what we choose to rebuild." When the doors opened, the sunlight poured in across the polished floor, and the restored fragments of his plane gleamed like memory reborn. Later, as the visitors drifted away, Lucas stepped outside alone. The runway stretched before him, long and empty, leading straight into the horizon. He closed his eyes, feeling the familiar pull of the wind against his skin, and for a moment it was as if the engine of his old plane hummed somewhere beyond hearing. The fight was over, but the sky remained, vast, quiet, and waiting. He smiled faintly and whispered to the wind, "I'm home."